on where American relations with the GCC are going. To say that US-GCC relations have become somewhat more complicated will be an understatement. A number of factors, the Gulf's perception or perhaps the reality of reduced US interest in the Middle East, the contretemps with the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Certainly, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has thrown a monkey wrench into the works. But we've had these frictions before. Concerned about growing U.S. concerns about growing GCC ties with China. Most of the GCC monarchies were upset at what appeared to be tacit U.S. support for the Arab Spring. Obama's signature of the JCPOA with Iran. All these complicated the relationship, but of late, as we said, with the everything that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine has brought up has really put the relationship into a turmoil, perhaps the most dramatic being that both Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed snubbed President Biden's effort to make a phone call. So where are we going? What do we do next? I, for one, am confused. We have today four people who know as much or more than I do on the subject to enlighten us on it. The first speaker will be Professor David de Roches, a good friend, associate professor at the nearest Asia Center and a senior fellow at the Gulf International Forum, graduate of West Point, and a longtime member of the U.S. military and later in the Defense Department responsible for the region. Next, Anna Jacobs is just a senior political officer with the IC group, focusing on Track 2 dialogue for mutual security in the Middle East and on Gulf regional security issues. Followed by Dr. Kenneth Katzman, who is here not in his official capacity, but has worked at the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress on Middle East issues, perhaps the most august of all the research facilities in the United States. And finally, Dr. Robert Gallucci, distinguished professor, practice of diplomacy, and a very good friend of mine who had the misfortune to be my boss for a time when we were both in political military affairs in the State Department. He has held numerous other State Department positions and was the dean of the School of Foreign Service when we opened the Georgetown University in Qatar. Anyway, let's kick it off. David?
Well, thank you very much. Anis is bringing up my slides, but I have to point out that I do not speak for the U.S. government as well. I'm going to give a brief tour d'horizon of U.S.-GCC relations and what the partnership means and some of the things that concern us. Next slide, please. So, as we all know, the relations started with the meeting between Roosevelt and Abdulaziz in the Great Bitter Lake, and it has been defined by oil and by security, which these images represent. Next slide, please. However, next slide. The relationship in recent years has sort of grown into something that was not planned, but rather was driven by events. So there was no significant military footprint, U.S. military footprint in the region until the invasion of Iraq by Saddam Hussein. Most recently, the relationship has been personalized, where the leaders of various countries think that they had a personal relationship with various presidents rather than a country-to-country relationship. And of course, this was epitomized in the decision for the blockade of Qatar under the Trump administration about a week and a half after this photograph was taken. Next slide, please. Lately, what we've seen is that relationships are not as good as thought. And there's a couple reasons for this. The first is President Biden, when he was running for office, called for Saudi Arabia to be made a pariah state. And the two main irritants there, which I think these are statements that were probably necessary for him to secure his party's nomination, were the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, our friend, and a friend of the Gulf International Forum, and the ongoing war in Yemen. And unfortunately, it appears as though Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular have tried to snub President Biden, but they're doing it in a way that is at risk of appearing to be a snub of the United States. Next slide, please. The basis for the U.S. military involvement is the Carter Doctrine. And this is the statement that President Carter said in the State of the Union address in 2000. I highlighted and read the important points here, which basically is the Carter Doctrine is, and it has been exercised more than Article 5 of the NATO Treaty has been exercised. The Carter Doctrine does not commit the United States to defending the regimes of the GCC states or the Gulf, but rather to protect them from invasion from an outside force. And our friends in the Gulf, particularly during the Arab Spring, sometimes mistook that. Next slide, please. Now, in the context of this, our partners in the GCC tend to think that the United States military commitment to the region is declining because the metric that they use are the number of people who actually sleep overnight in a GCC state. But it's important to note that there's been a broad trend of U.S. forces overseas being reduced, not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe and in East Asia. And you can see this global reduction. Next slide, please. If you look historically at the longer term, you can see that U.S. forces overseas tend to spike and then draw down to a relatively settled state. The green line are U.S. forces in the Middle East, and it was more or less a negligible presence until the Iraq invasion of 2003 and the Afghanistan invasion of 2002. That has since declined. This number only goes to 2015. But the important point to raise here is that the GCC countries are exceptionally good hosts. And a lot of the American forces who were in the GCC states over the last 20 years were not there to defend the GCC states. They were there to support operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So when you see that green line spiking and then declining, you can expect a commensurate decline in U.S. forces who bed down in the GCC states. Next slide, please. This shows U.S. forces and contractors in Afghanistan. And again, over time, you can see that it rises and then it falls and eventually goes to zero. There should be a commensurate spike and decline in the number of U.S. forces in the Gulf states who were supporting operations in Afghanistan. And again, this is a reflection of the superior defense relations between those countries and the United States. They're just very, very good hosts, and they pay for a lot of things that the United States would have to pay for itself in other countries. So when you see the troop levels in the Middle East declining, you have to weigh it against this Afghan footprint, and that will kind of explain part of the reason. Next slide, please. This shows U.S. forces in Iraq. It's since gone down, and the Department of Defense stopped releasing these figures, but we think it's about 2,500 from over 100,000. So again, a commensurate decrease in support forces and logistic forces based in the Gulf. Next slide, please. These pictures show kind of where the United States is going. And one of the important points, if there's one point you take from me today, it's that you don't have to physically sit on a place to be committed to its defense. So the United States footprint in the Gulf has evolved into a more substantial presence that can be rapidly reinforced rather than forces bedding down over there. So the picture on the left shows what I think is perhaps the most enduring sign of U.S. military commitment to Saudi Arabia, the opening of a post exchange at Prince Sultan Air Base in El Kharj, Saudi Arabia. PSAB was closed in 2003 at the Saudi request, and its functions were moved to El Udeid Air Base. After the Abqaiq attacks, it was reopened. It hosts air units and had some air defense units, although they've since drawn down. But basically, it has the ability, once you have a post exchange, that shows commitment. You can rapidly expand. And it's worth noting that the United States just moved an armor brigade to Poland in 1 week. That's with its equipment. No other country in the world can do that. So given that we now have the infrastructure of bases that are semi-warm, semi-robust, we can expand that quickly. The picture on the upper right-hand corner shows the development of a trans-Arabian logistic network, which the U.S. Army is the main lead for. This ultimately, I believe, will be rail, but right now it's road-based and allows the United States and its partners to reinforce the GCC states without having to transit the Strait of Hormuz. The picture on the bottom right-hand corner shows that capability being exercised, where the U.S. landed armored forces on the Red Sea ports and then moved it overland to the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. Next slide, please. So that's a quick review. The point that I want to leave you with is that the relationship is stronger than it's ever been, but the relationship is not one that is reflected in boot count or in bed downs overnight, but rather it's a commitment to do it. The infrastructure that we have in place in the GCC states is as robust as it's ever been throughout our history. And focusing on the absolute troop numbers, I think, is the wrong indicator to estimate the U.S. Security commitment to our security partners. And with that, I will await your most difficult questions. Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. Let me give you an easy one. What's the status of our pre-positioning facilities? If I remember, when I left Qatar many a long year ago, we had the U.S. Army's largest pre-positioning facility in the world in Qatar, equivalent of about 2/3 of a heavy division, plus pre-positioning in Kuwait, and that hasn't changed, if I remember.
Yeah. So the Kuwait thank you. It's really disappointing when I tried to research that at Camp El Saleh. The only reference I could find was to myself, which is, I'm like, Jesus, there's got to be somebody better on this. So the depot at Camp El Saleh has been moved to Jordan, which makes sense. I think that we did a review and realized that having all of our facilities clustered, if our primary threat is Iran, having all of our facilities clustered along the littoral coast with Iran is not wise. So those facilities were moved to Jordan. The pre-positioning facility in Kuwait remains in place because we constantly rotate through armored brigades to train in Kuwait, which gives us, in effect, a second brigade presence in Kuwait.
Thank you. Moving on now, this is a really good presentation on what our facts are when it comes to America's footprint and commitment in the Gulf. Ms. Jacobs, how do the Gulf states view this relationship?
Yes, good evening from Qatar, and Ramadan Kareem to everyone as well. I would just like to thank you so much for inviting me onto this wonderful panel. To kind of answer this question a little bit, I'd like to focus on 4 key points, which should be within the time allotted, hopefully. So first, GCC countries view the U.S. as their most important security partner. Defense and energy are the 2 main elements of U.S.-GCC relations. Major U.S. and European maritime security operations are present in the region's waterways, as are significant U.S. military and naval outposts. Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain are major non-NATO allies, while Saudi Arabia and the UAE are key security partners to the U.S. for reasons relating to their crucial role in energy markets and in geopolitics more broadly. We are seeing this particularly clearly at the present moment due to Saudi and Emirati influence in OPEC Plus, as well as Qatar's huge role as a top exporter of LNG. In other words, Gulf states are at the forefront of the current global push to reduce reliance on Russian energy. Their strategic value as security partners in stabilizing energy markets and hopefully cooperating on key geopolitical issues such as the Ukraine crisis is very clear for the U.S. at the present moment, acting as a strong reminder that the U.S. cannot just pivot away from the Middle East, ignore their concerns, and then expect regional allies to side with them at crucial moments. GCC countries also, I think, to varying degrees, seek to maintain neutrality among the great powers. I think this is in large part due to China's role as a top trading partner with the GCC and also Russia's role in OPEC Plus. My second point is that obviously relations right now between the US and some GCC countries are strained. Relations with the US vary among GCC countries, and I think the expectations and level of satisfaction are somewhat different between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one hand and Qatar on the other. There's also still, I think, significant mistrust and competition at an intra-GCC level. Even after the Al-Ula agreement was signed. But I think that we can probably talk more on that issue later. So despite some very real differences in threat perceptions from GCC countries, I do think there are shared concerns among them about perceived US strategic disengagement from the region and what this means for Middle East regional security. Saudi Arabia and UAE ties with the US seem to be especially under pressure now, as you all both mentioned. I would say also most recently due to what they perceive as a weak US reaction to the Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These two countries have also been particularly reluctant to join the West in isolating Russia and in increasing oil output. But I do think it's important to note that Gulf concerns about US policy go back many years, especially since 9/11 and America's invasion of Iraq. GCC countries' concerns about US policy, I think, contrary to what many say, were present during both Republican and Democratic control of the White House. My third point quickly is, I think as many of us know, GCC countries expect the US to play a security guarantor role and to help protect their countries from what they see as Iranian aggression. This is often, done through weapons sales and defense cooperation, but also through, I think, or what they would like, greater coordination, communication, and diplomatic alignment on key issues like the war in Yemen. The US has not done this in the eyes of some GCC countries at various times in recent years. In reaction, I think some GCC countries are cultivating ties with other potential security partners, such as Israel or Turkey, as well as setting up, new regional alliances, such as among the Abraham Accords countries, which in their view, I think could help fill this security vacuum and act as a sort of firewall against Iran. There is also, I think, the expectation from GCC countries that the strategic value of the region's maritime routes and natural resources to the international economy requires international security protections, which do exist through the presence of international maritime security missions, as well as multiple US military outposts. I think Washington believes they are doing enough, but I think several GCC countries clearly would not agree. They want more defensive support to counter what they view as Iranian aggression. They want more policy alignment on issues like Yemen and against Iranian proxies like the Houthis. And then my very last point, if I have a little bit of time left, I think GCC countries, this is especially what I'm hearing in a lot of my sort of track 2 work. I think GCC countries are quite confused about sort of US strategic objectives in the Middle East, both in the short term and in the long term. I think there is a clear misalignment between the US and some GCC countries about what a security partnership should look like and what GCC countries should expect from Washington. I think there's a lack of communication and growing mistrust about US commitments to their GCC allies and to wider regional security. And then lastly, I also believe that there's this perception that the US is sort of defining its policies in the Middle East largely through the lens of the Iran nuclear agreement, and that when and if the JCPOA is revived, then the US will consider its work accomplished and will pivot even more significantly away from the region towards great power competition with China and Russia. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That certainly covered the terrain very well. You did raise there was one issue that's always nagged at me. Right at the beginning, David Roches said that the U.S. had made it clear from the Carter Doctrine that we were there to keep the oil flowing and to keep stability in the region. In your opinion, Anna, do you see the greater GCC fear, and I know this varies from country to country, that the U.S. will fail to protect them against a foreign enemy, or that the U.S. will, as stated, is not concerned about internal conflict in these countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely a perception that the U.S. will not come to their aid in the face of any sort of external aggression. I think that they, view it in that way for, fairly valid reasons. Beyond kind of the most recent Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I think the other sort of notable issue that has come up and that's mentioned often is, again, under the Trump administration in 2019, that the Saudis were hit very, very hard. Oil facilities were hit very, very hard, and President Trump, who I think they felt that they had invested a lot in, and who they felt was a true friend, they realized that they couldn't rely even on someone like him to come to their aid and to react in a very clear way to Iranian aggression. So I think that because of that, as I said, somewhat, I think they are on the lookout for other security partners. I think there's a very clear realization that no other actor can play the role that the U.S. plays. And I think there's a very clear realization that China cannot play that role and does not want to, and that Russia, is limited as well. Some of these other regional actors, such as Israel and Turkey, again, I don't think that there's an expectation that they will come to their aid right away, but I think there is definitely a clear strategic shift towards investing in ties with countries like them. I think the idea is, again, to act as a deterrent more than anything else. And those relations, I think, are economic, absolutely, but I do think that there is a strong security element to, for example, Israel's relationship with the UAE now as well. So I hope I answered your question.
You did. Actually, you provided a great segue for Dr. Katzman, because that was the first time I heard Russia and China so far mentioned in the same sentence. And these clearly are the closest thing we've got to superpowers. with the ability to project force like the not the capability to project force, whether they're actually interested in doing so is a whole different question, which I hope you will help us answer. Dr. Katzman.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you to the Gulf International Forum. Let me just reiterate, I'm speaking in a purely personal capacity, not reflecting any views of anyone in Congress, Library of Congress, Congressional Research Service. So today's discussion asks the question whether the U.S. and the GCC states are allies or partners. The first two speakers, I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said. Obviously, we know there's plenty of tensions between particularly the United States and the Kingdom and the Emirates right now. Don't need to rehash that. Where I would go from there, though, is to say that the fundamental premise of many of the actions that we're seeing the Kingdom and the Emirates take recently is that somehow the United States needs them more than they need the United States. Or alternatively, that they can somehow threaten to expand ties with Russia or China or European powers, or as was said, Israel or somebody else, as a means of exercising leverage against the United States. To some extent, the UAE and Bahrain, with Saudi backing, perceive that their expanded relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords and extensions of that insulates them somehow from U.S. official criticism or gives them unassailable levers of power to wield in Washington via various interest groups here in the United States. Qatar appears to believe that its enormous reserves of natural gas and its hosting of U.S. forces at Al Udeid, which was mentioned, makes Qatar somehow indispensable to the United States. From the 30,000-foot level that I'm approaching the issue today, let me analyze that there are no clear alternatives to the United States to guarantee security of the Gulf. And I would argue, it can be argued, that the Gulf states do not have leverage against the United States that some Gulf leaders perceive that they have. Let me examine, okay, Russia and China. Let's delve a little bit, drill down a little bit. China's interests in the Gulf are primarily commercial and economic, not strategic. Beijing has no evident intent to project military power in the Gulf or to take responsibility for Gulf security. China is willing, of course, to benefit economically from Gulf energy reserves, but it has shown little willingness or ability to give the Gulf states anything back in terms of security or significant success in conflict resolution. Nor has China displayed any real intent or capability to restrain Iran's actions in the region or to help roll back Tehran's influence. China has just demonstrated no value really in accomplishing any rollback of Tehran's influence. Even though obviously China and Iran have developed extremely close economic relations. China is actually buying more oil than they did in 2016, even before the sanctions were lifted, lifted, or even before they were imposed in 2012. China is buying almost 1 million barrels of oil a day from Iran right now. Yet China accounts for barely 1% of Saudi oil arms imports. The notion that the Gulf states can easily transition to China as an arms supplier seems to strain credulity. And even when some Gulf states have approached China, for example, China reportedly was building some sort of a military facility at Khalifa Port. They've been helping the Saudis with indigenous missile production capabilities. The United States basically told the UAE, unless you reduce some of these potential military aspects of this relationship, you're not going to get the F-35. So the United States was able to exercise leverage, and the UAE did close down the Khalifa Port facility that China was building. The Saudis, as I said, have turned to China for some missile technology to build missiles indigenously, But that seems to reflect more Saudi nervousness that, they can't get missiles from the United States because of U.S. Anti-proliferation laws and executive orders. And the United States cannot sell offensive ballistic missile technology to the Saudis. It does not represent any real inroads by China into the kingdom or Gulf security. Some of the Gulf leaders, MBZ, Amir Tamim, have made repeated, let's switch to Russia. Let's look at Russia. Amir Tamim, MBZ, has made repeated visits to visit Putin in Russia. Yet Russia's role in the region remains relatively limited to Syria and to a lesser extent Libya. And the Gulf-Russia relationship has been mainly confined to energy issues in terms of the OPEC plus arrangement to control or to shape oil production decisions. Russia continues to market weaponry to the Gulf with mixed success. Its arms sales to the Gulf are less than 1% of Gulf arms buys. Some of the Gulf states have discussed or looked at possibly buying the S-400. But again, that would, if they did, the U.S. has indicated that might trigger sanctions under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, the CATSA law. And in fact, they have not gone ahead with purchasing the S-400. Now, Russia's ties to the Gulf have paid some dividends. The UAE did abstain on the resolution last 2 months ago on Ukraine, but that was really in return for Russia's support on a resolution embargoing arms to the Houthis. It wasn't because the UAE sees any great value right now in Russia. And I would add, just to the core of my analysis is the invasion of Ukraine is going to greatly reduce Russia's influence in the Gulf going forward. The invasion of Ukraine has turned Moscow and Putin into a global pariah. The poor performance of Russia's military in Ukraine has reduced Gulf leaders' estimation of Russian military technology and Russia's strategic value more generally. The Gulf states are going to come under significant pressure from the United States to break off any security-related discussions with Moscow and to enforce U.S. and European, or to join U.S. and European sanctions on Russia. These sanctions, Russia's pariah status, Putin's pariah status, are going to remain as long as Putin remains in office, even if there's a settlement in Ukraine, I would argue. And that's going to cause Gulf leaders to think twice about entertaining any Russian appeals to help rebuild Syria or do anything that Russia wants them to do in the region. The Gulf states will continue some cooperation with Moscow on energy issues to possibly exert leverage on Washington. But the idea of an expanded strategic relationship between the Gulf and Russia now, I think, is relatively unthinkable. So just to wind down, I think clearly if the GCC was betting on Russia as some sort of a counterweight to the United States, the GCC leaders, particularly in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, have clearly bet on the wrong horse, I would argue. If they were betting on Mr. Putin, they have bet on the wrong horse. I think that's clear. None of Russia's military technology can be trusted to work as expected. The Russian military performance in Ukraine has been an embarrassment to Russia. I think there's no question, not even a debate about that. There's simply no rationale for any expansion of ties between Russia, for the Gulf states to expand ties with Russia. So in sum, to wind down, conclude, in sum, the Ukraine events, in my judgment, have proven once again that the United States' role in the Gulf is indispensable and irreplaceable. I look forward to your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katzman. I think we lost our moderator. We're trying to get him back online. If you move to Ambassador Gallucci for your opening remarks. I think you are muted. Ambassador Gallucci, you are muted.
All right. Okay, how about this?
Great, thank you.
Okay, so first let me thank GIF for the opportunity to participate in this panel. Let me say excellent panel. I find myself in violent agreement with my colleagues on almost every issue. I hope that doesn't disappoint. It's always a pleasure to be with Patrick. He mentioned we worked together. That was 40 years ago in the State Department on security issues. And for those of you who want to imagine something truly entertaining, you need to imagine Patrick explaining Lebanon's confessional system to an admiral who was our boss. That was, as they say, worth the price of admission. I'm obviously here not to talk about the Middle East or the GCC, but to talk about American foreign policy and what motivates U.S. policy, what I think motivates U.S. policy, and to describe a bit about what the U.S. government has been saying about our interests and the threats to U.S. interests. We do not have the 2022 U.S. defense strategy, which will come from the Department of Defense, but we do have the fact sheet for that strategy. And we do not have the national security strategy, which will come from the White House, but we do have hints about it, and particularly from the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan's statement on April 1st, devoted to the Middle East. And you will note April 1st is April Fool's Day, and I'm assuming that was a mere coincidence. So what do we think we know about the Biden administration's take on U.S. interests? If you look at the Defense Department statement, it lists 3 priorities from the Department of Defense for the United States of America: homeland defense, no surprise; strategic attacks on the United States and its allies and partners, note partners, not a surprise; and third, regional threats, enumerated as the Indo-Pacific, read China, and Russia and Europe. Note here, please, that the Middle East does not make the cut, not in the fact sheet on American strategy. And there is, however, a paragraph on persistent threats. And under that rubric, we have North Korea and Iran. But as my colleague noted, Iran is considered a threat because of its nuclear weapons program. It is a non-proliferation threat rather than indicated as a regional threat to our partners. And that's it. Just as interesting, I think, is National Security Advisor Sullivan's statement on how U.S. aims to make the Middle East, and I quote now, secure and integrated, whatever that exactly means, by deterrence of adversaries and diplomacy where possible. Okay. There is then underlined the historic March 28th meeting in Israel of foreign ministers of the UAE and Bahrain, Egypt and Morocco, Israel and the United States, where permanent working groups on security and economic development resulted. There is, in this meeting, something stunning for someone like myself, and here I admit some ignorance of developments of late. Secretary Blinken goes to Ramallah, but the Palestinian issue doesn't become part of the main event. And this proceeds, and that's news, it would seem to me. In the statement by National Security Advisor Sullivan, he mentions U.S. interests in seeing the war in Yemen come to an end. He mentions the Biden administration's commitment to defend our partners, and here the UAE and Saudi Arabia are mentioned as our partners. That's it. New sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile procurement networks, but again, I'd say read that as nuclear weapons proliferation concerns. My bottom line about the U.S. approach to the GCC these days and to the Middle East generally follows from what I think is the way the administration looks at foreign policy. The U.S. has pivoted to Asia, is the first and most obvious thing that comes out of the documents as we see them, and that means China, of course. Russia and Ukraine are, I would characterize for the administration, extremely important distractions, but really distractions. The Middle East is largely reduced in terms of threats to our security as Iran, as a nuclear weapons state, only secondarily as a regional threat to our partners. Israel doesn't receive particularly noticeable mention as it would have in the past, but I would argue to you it endures as an important ally, even without mention. The U.S. has, I think, noticed Saudi disinterest in American concerns about the Khashoggi affair, about the war in Yemen, and about the Saudi reluctance to respond to us positively, at least so far, on oil production. And the encouragement, Saudi encouragement of both China and Russia as they pivot in that direction or try to. That said, I join my colleagues in thinking that's not a pivot that's going to succeed, and the U.S. remains the essential power for the region. What I think I see is a White House right now that is looking for the Democratic Party's version of America First. The midterms are coming, and they will define politics in the coming months, particularly as the administration seeks to essentially play defense because it is on the defense. There is clearly a popular disinterest in what we might call internationalism, particularly in wars of choice. I think there's going to be a continued search for the middle class benefit from our foreign policy, and Biden often refers to that. And I think finally that there's a disinterest in advancing democracy, a phrase that we're hearing frequently, and we're hearing it in the context of Ukraine. But I think for the American people, that slogan is a bit too aggressive and suggestive of a foreign policy that the American people are looking for a rest or a respite from. I think the most Democrats can hope for is to defend democracy at home, where apparently it needs some defending. Thank you.
Right in, but my internet went out while you were speaking, so I have absolutely no idea what you said except for the last two sentences. So
Perfect.
So if this is redundant, please forgive me. But I'd like to ask, how much is there real American hostility, in your opinion, at both the popular and the political level towards the Gulf states in general, towards Saudi Arabia, or is this sort of a minor factor, as opposed to just not wanting to have foreign entanglements anymore?
I love questions like that, Patrick, because they beg for an answer that's absent of evidence, and I can deliver just such an answer. It seems to me that if we're really saying what does America think, America doesn't disaggregate the Middle East very much, I think. And if you refer to the GCC, generally speaking, they'd have no idea what you were talking about. And I don't think any of the divisions in the Middle East that we have been seeing over the last 10 or 15 years are the American public is in any way aware of. I don't think they're beyond Sunni Shia. So I think you start with a lack of any subtlety or sophistication here on the part of the United States of America. I've been arguing here that what you do have is an American public that's tired of engagement that is costly, and they'd like a respite from that. And had the president managed to get his bureaucracy to withdraw those troops from Afghanistan with just a tad bit more elegance than an act that actually occurred, I think he'd be a hero for having done that. It's hard to claim herohood under the circumstances. But so I think it's not so much a hostility or anything, to go back to your question, but I think they're less interested in the international arena, except in terms of how it might impact their life. I mean, I think right now we're hoping that a lot of us are, the United States, generally those people you just mentioned, are going to be able to accept that there's going to be a cost to us and at home to the middle class to imposing a cost on Putin and Russia for what they've done. We'd like the American people to accept that. And I think they probably will.
Well, that leads me to a larger question. Right now, the biggest thing happening in the world is the Ukraine war. If you try to sort of triangulate where the Middle East, where the Gulf states and the GCC fit into this in the American reaction to the Ukraine war and to what the Gulf states are doing, is this driving us further apart, having no effect, or has the potential to draw us closer together? And since I just asked you a question, let me put that to Anna first and then to the others.
Great. Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to try to kind of connect all of these a little bit. So I'm definitely in agreement that Americans obviously are less concerned about the Middle East, especially the GCC, and wouldn't even know really what that is. But I do think that they are concerned right now about inflation, and they are concerned about the price of oil and gas. And right now, I mean, my understanding is that, you know, inflation is really a huge issue in the US right now, and it's set to get worse. So I do think that that's where I think all of these sort of various factors kind of connect. And then just one more point as well. You know, my view is that it's not that GCC countries, or it's not that some GCC countries are betting on Russia so much or hedging. I think that they're using the current context for leverage. I think it's still, this is all about how to recalibrate their relationship with the US. I think it's less about pivoting east, and I think it's more about showing the US how geostrategically valuable GCC countries are. And so this is, and I think that I believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the sort of direct and indirect economic impacts of that, whether that be the rising price of oil, or whether that be rising prices of food, wheat, corn, you know, I think this is a real concern for the US. And I think that we will be seeing a bit of a recalibration of the US-GCC relationship moving forward. What exactly that will look like, I'm not sure, but I think that will definitely happen. Thank you.
Anybody else? David or Dr. Katzman? Kenneth?
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. You know, I think Qatar is definitely in a pivotal position here. I mean, I think it's clear after what we saw in terms of the massacres that have been committed in Ukraine. You know, your question was about the effect of the Ukraine war. There's going to be more pressure to divorce Europe from Russian gas. Russia supplies about 40% of the average European Union's natural gas supplies, and the European Union is still buying Russian gas. Even now, the sanctions did not ban that per se. So obviously suppliers, and Qatar is the big kahuna on the block in terms of natural gas in the GCC. I don't think there's any question about that. Mr. Biden met with Amir Tamim 2 months ago in the White House, basically asking him to make more gas available in case Russia shut off the gas. Well, Russia didn't shut off the gas, but now the European Union wants to get off Russian gas supplies. So, you know, there is going to be a lot of spotlight on Qatar as to whether they can make more gas available, get it to Europe, and get the contract signed to line that up. I don't think there's any question about that.
Just from my own knowledge of Qatari gas policies, the fact does remain that the Qataris have always written long-term contracts for virtually all their gas exports,
Right.
and the Europeans don't do them. I think that there's even a regulation in Europe that prevents long-term contracts, and I don't know how they're going to. Somebody's going to have to blink on that one, and I honestly don't know which one will first. It's a huge investment in gas. LNG requires a huge upfront investment, and the Qataris have always been reluctant to do that sort of thing on spec. Which raises another point. I had lunch the other day with one of the top commentators and lobbyists who remain nameless for this in Washington, and he opined that particularly in Saudi Arabia, perhaps in the Emirates, there is a longing for or nostalgia for the relationship with the previous president, with Donald Trump, and that much of what is happening today, the refusal to back down from the OPEC plus limitations, the other steps they've taken, are a clumsy Saudi attempt to see if they can throw the elections to the Republicans and get Trump back into office. Any thoughts on that to anybody? Volunteers? Nobody wants to touch. Hey, Robert?
Yeah.
So I think you said clumsy effort. I think clumsy would be an understatement. I really do. I mean, I think that's quite a reach to think that you're going to impact the American election that way. I can't imagine it, actually.
Now, I don't think it's necessarily trying to swing the election as it is to, Saudi Arabia and the UAE felt that Trump was a guy with whom they could do business. They were disappointed by the muted response to the Abqaiq attacks and to the Iranian naval attacks in 2019, but they felt at the end of the day that he was somebody that they were simpatico with. Biden's remarks in the campaign, particularly, calling for Saudi Arabia to be made a pariah state, which, a Wahhabi state, comparing them to the lowest caste of Hindu. I don't think anybody's just analyzed how offensive that is. That is something that I think they just want to remind the president that they have options. And, even though these are Muslim states, they're very fond of the analogy Catholic marriage. And they, I think, want to basically let Biden know that I'm not sure they're trying to swing the election, but I do think they're trying to impose costs.
Hello, yeah, Anna?
Yeah, I also think it's important to remember a bit. I mean, several GCC countries have been pursuing talks and outreach with Iran in the last year or so. So I also think, though, that it's important to remember that several GCC countries, I think, saw the limits of maximum pressure. I think that there are significant concerns that, for example, if the Vienna talks don't move anywhere, that tensions will rise. And I do not think that they have an interest in tensions rising. I do not think that Saudi and the UAE want conflict with Iran in any way. What I think that they're attempting, is, again, I think it's more focused on both setting up deterrence while at the same time thinking through how to gain leverage also with Iran. So there has been kind of an increase in sort of economic diplomacy between the UAE and Iran as well. So all of this is to kind of say that, part of what's happening is that I think several GCC countries are trying to take a bit more ownership over their strategic priorities, and that they actually, I think, were more aligned with the Biden administration on some key issues than what is commonly sort of said. And so I don't think it's a clear that, some of them would prefer a Trump to what's happening now. As, many of you all noted, I think there was pretty significant disappointment that they invested so much in their relationship with President Trump and that it really didn't lead to what they wanted. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Well, along the same vein, then, do we see sort of greater concern among the GCC states that they're being abandoned? And is this concern driving them together? Is there any indication that they may, or that they're looking at some sort of common response to a world that is changing rapidly and in ways they don't like? Or is it actually splintering them? And Anna, you're the best place to answer this, so I hate to hit you again at another question.
I think this is a really good question. There's a U.S. GCC working group, and their working group on Iran met, I think, end of last year. And I thought it was really interesting because it outlined that, GCC countries support, again, a return to, or for the U.S. and Iran to return to full compliance. And, and basically that they supported this diplomatic work, and also that if U.S. sanctions are lifted, GCC countries would pursue greater economic relations with Iran. And again, this was a joint, announcement, right? And I do think that there is some alignment on Iran in some ways. This doesn't mean that there are not very different threat perceptions about Iran. That's definitely true. There are some key differences among GCC countries. But I think in various ways, they are trying to pursue some kind of outreach. So, for Saudi Arabia, it's through direct bilateral talks with Iran, even if they're on hold now. For the UAE, it's also kind of pursuing talks and exploring sort of how to grow the economic cooperation. For Qatar, the Iranian president was here. He was here in February. And this was his first visit to the GCC, from what I know. And so, I think that while they are all pursuing outreach with Iran in different ways, I think they are more aligned than they have been in the past on that specific issue. So I do think in some ways, yes, they are, I think, trying to be more on the same page than they were. I think obviously the signing of El Ula helped in some ways, but there are obviously still major issues between them that aren't necessarily going away. But I think that many GCC countries are just trying to focus on other issues and really trying to prioritize how to keep conflict low. So I hope that helps. Thanks.
Yeah. This is also leads us to the other powers, so to speak, the regional powers. There was some discussion earlier that the GC or some of the GCC have two countries that are developing or trying to develop deeper relationships with the GCC. One is Israel, the other is Turkey, that is trying to repair its relationships. Do any of those? How do they play in the GCC threat/security relationship? Dr. Katzman, let me try.
Well, Turkey is a little bit of a difficult. Turkey divides the GCC. There are divisions within the GCC on Turkey. As you remember, with the 2017, the blockade, the whole rift, part of one of the 13 demands that the Saudis and UAE gave Qatar to end the blockade was to ask Turkish troops to leave and decrease its relations with Turkey. And Turkey and Qatar have been aligned in Syria to some extent, in Libya particularly, and the Saudis and the UAE on the other side of those, factional struggles and conflicts. So Turkey is a difficult issue that has divided the GCC among each other. Again, much as Iran has too. Differences, again, Saudi, UAE, and Bahrain on one side of the issue. The Qataris, Kuwaitis, and Omanis more of a pro-engagement, the pro-engagement side on the GCC towards the Islamic Republic. There's been some convergence lately on Iran, but I'm not convinced it's really going to go anywhere. I mean, we've seen the UAE lobby aggressively for this arms embargo by the UN on the Houthis. We've seen the UAE insist that President Biden put the Houthis back on the terrorism list. As you remember, Mr. Trump put them on the terrorism list within the last couple of weeks of his administration. Mr. Biden took them off the list. And now the UAE wants the Houthis back on the list. So that's, and it's all Iran related. So I'm not convinced there's as much convergence as we might think. On Israel, obviously, there's, again, differences. Again, the same cleavage. The UAE, Bahrain on one side, normalizing with Israel, Saudi Arabia supporting that, although not normalizing itself with Israel. And the Qataris and Kuwaitis and the Omanis talking about the need to uphold Arab commitments to the Palestinians. So, a lot of these cleavages, there's attempts to heal them, but the divisions and debates continue in my judgment. Thank you.
This then leads to another question. I can't even read my handwriting. That's really great. What was the GCC, what more precisely the UAE up to with the visit of Bashar al-Assad to Syria? Was the U.S. relationship a factor in any of that? Was it something the UAE was doing it to sort of stick something in our eye, or do you think that the UAE had other motivations in mind when it invited Assad to come visit? Anybody?
Can I take a stab at that?
Absolutely.
So there's sort of a parade of grievances that the UAE has towards the U.S. It starts with the publication of the Pivot, which was actually from Europe, but folks in the Gulf thought that was away from the Middle East. Then you have the Arab Spring, and in particular, the precedent of the United States. The phrase used by Gulf leaders is "threw Mubarak under the bus." Then you have the Obama red line in Syria, which proved to be no line at all. Then, of course, particularly in the instance of the UAE, fast forwarding a little bit, when you had the missile and drone attacks on Abu Dhabi, that was a big issue for the UAE. And, it's worth pointing out that, all of the missiles fired into Saudi Arabia, those have been intercepted by Saudi crews, but American crews actually participated in the interception of the missiles fired at Abu Dhabi. So the UAE expected a much more robust American reaction. And they expected the Houthis to immediately be put on the terrorist sanction list. I think they expected a military reaction against missile launch sites, because they made the point that these missiles are targeted at American forces, not just at Emirati forces. So in that context, I think you have to look at the Bashar al-Assad in two lights. The first is, I think there's an objective case to be made that, rightly or wrongly, the guy's a war criminal, he's a monster, but he's won. So we've got to find a way to deal with it. That's point A, just a pragmatic point. The second point is I do think this is a way of needling the Biden administration, letting them know, you can't talk to us, and say, that we need to be isolated, that we can't be sold the weapons that we're willing to pay for. This is the Emirati narrative that we can use, better than any other country in the Gulf. Again, the Emirati narrative. And then expect us to follow you in lockstep on every action of this when you're not with us when we need you the most. Again, that's, I believe, the Emirati narrative there. And I think that those two motives conflict, or combine rather, to explain the Assad visit.
Yeah, mind you, I tend to have sometimes a little bit of impatience with the lack of realism, sometimes with my friends in the Gulf. Recently, the Ukrainians launched attack helicopters, blew apart an oil storage facility on territory of the Russian Republic. And, however angry Putin may have been, he just regarded that as, well, it just complicates talking. But he didn't say that that was an unprovoked attack on Russia, because the Russians, after all, are attacking the Ukraine from Russia. I am constantly surprised that the air forces of the UAE and Saudi Arabia have occasionally, often, frequently pulverized targets in Yemen, and yet sort of hitting back the counter battery fire from the Houthis from Yemen always strikes them as something illegal that they're trying to sell to us. Do you think this is just a failure to understand the realities of war, or that there is some political argument to be used with us on this? Yeah. Anybody? Anna?
Yeah, I also just want to jump in on the question of the Bashar al-Assad visit to the UAE. I think, I think the Emiratis right now are very much trying to explore new ways of trying to curb Iranian influence. And I think that the visit and the outreach to Assad, which has been happening for a while, is also just about trying to begin to curb Iran's role in Syria. And I think that the UAE is particularly well placed to exert more sort of economic influence. I think this is really what they're trying to focus on, not just even with Iran, but with these other countries where Iranian influence is very high. They're trying this in Iraq also. And so, I think that that's a big part of their sort of strategy of outreach to everyone, of trying to find a way to kind of work with everyone. And I think this is also, a big part of kind of their more recent outreach to Turkey also. So I think it's just important to, keep that in mind as well. And then could you repeat your second question? I'm sorry.
Sure. That was in the Ukraine conflict, Ukrainian helicopters crossed the border into Russia and blew something up. And the Russians, whatever they thought about it, didn't really regard this as illegal. And yet in the Saudi Arabia and the UAE's case, counter battery fire, where the Houthis are shooting back at at countries that are bombing them with their air forces, is somehow or other an argument for making the Houthis terrorists. Is this just tactics on their part, or do they really think that they should be immune from attack?
I think the perception in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi as well is really that, they're under pretty direct attack all the time. And I think their threat perceptions are extremely high. And I just think that their perception is that no other country would kind of tolerate this level of, direct attacks. And so again, I'm not saying I share this view necessarily, but what I'm saying is that, you know, I do think that they feel quite outraged that the U.S. is not helping them.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying that I think that this is a very strongly held view. I think that from their perspective, they are trying to curb and limit the power of an Iranian proxy in the Arabian Peninsula, which they see really as, you know, the ultimate threat. And, you know, I think that they also feel that they are fighting a war in support of the, you know, internationally recognized government of Yemen. And so I just think that this is their view on it. And I think that, you know, oftentimes there's not maybe enough of an appreciation for exactly how disastrous this war is, not just from a humanitarian point of view, but also just in terms of, you know, U.S. domestic politics. I mean, it's just toxic. And I just, and again, rightly so. But, you know, again, I just don't know if there's enough of an appreciation in Riyadh, you know, and elsewhere for exactly how bad it actually is.
Can I pile on this?
David, sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is, I agree with everything Anna said. Let me just give you one sort of systemic problem with military equipment. People over time, and this is a universal problem, they tend to conflate military capability with strategy. And so, you know, the coalition campaign in Yemen is basically shock and awe. That's not a strategy. That's a salesmanship. You know, it's like, you know, if you have the ability, you know, you invest in long range strike precision guided munitions, you can bring a country to its knees within weeks. And that didn't work for NATO in Kosovo. It hasn't worked in Yemen, but people still persist in it. So at the same time, people also misunderstand missile defense. They think it's like the dome in the Simpsons movie. It just drops on a city and it's impervious. It's actually point defense. The problem is when you're under attack, that's the only time you really focus on the actual limitations of the system. And so I think that when a country is under attack that has been a longstanding U.S. security partner, they say to themselves, how could this happen? And their next thought is, you know, we thought our relationship with the United States rendered us immune to attacks. And if we are attacked, we expect the full weight of the United States to respond to that attack. And if you get anything less than that, it calls the underlying precepts, which should have been examined and discussed at the point of sale, but very rarely are. It calls that all into question. And this is a universal problem that we've seen among NATO partners, that we've seen among our partners in the Far East, and that we're seeing in our partners in the GCC because they're under, you know, repeated missile and drone attack.
Yeah, we've got only a couple minutes left. Could we sort of take it from the top again in the same order? And last question for 1 minute each. Where are we going to be in a year on US-GCC relations? David?
I think it depends on the JCPOA. Secretary Blinken made comments today that indicated he felt that the JCPOA talks weren't going anywhere. I think if he walks away from the JCPOA and takes a more muscular approach, relations with the GCC will improve. I think that if the GCC feels that their interests are sacrificed in an Iran deal, that we will be in a sort of state where our partners are waiting for the November elections and then trying to cut a deal with a new regime in Washington.
Anna? Dr. Katzman, you're next in row.
Well, you know, I think it's probably going to continue to be contentious with particularly the Kingdom and the Emirates. The fundamental differences, it's not just about necessarily the JCPOA. It's the criticism is that the United States is not doing enough to roll back Iran's influence in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, Yemen, the Houthis. And I don't necessarily see U.S. policy necessarily changing in any of those theaters. So, you know, I think it's going to still be tough. And the Ukraine invasion has given the Kingdom and the Emirates more, what they think is even more leverage because of oil. and they're gonna try to extract every possible pound of flesh out of the Biden administration as they can. And I think that just sets up for more contentious debates. And so I can't necessarily be optimistic of an improvement over the coming year.
Anna?
I agree with that for sure. I guess a more optimistic view I would like to add is if there's a revival of the JCPOA, best case scenario, GCC countries will work with the US and use that as a sort of building block to a regional security dialogue between GCC countries and Iran. That's what I think many of us hope will happen. But I think, as my colleagues have said, I think that's looking less and less likely. So thank you.
Robert, bases are loaded and you're coming on to the cleanup. I think you're muted.
The thing that has struck me and that I wanted to hear my colleagues talk about, but probably won't, is the GCC attitudes towards the JCPOA and what they really hope for. They're looking for a continuing contentious relationship between the US and Iran that gets bad, but not very bad, but certainly doesn't get good. This to me is a problem, because what the critics and maybe in the GCCs have seen of the JCPOA is that it'll end up providing Iran with the funds to do exactly what GCC would rather not have Iran do. And of course, from the American perspective, there's still the hope that with the nuclear issue managed, then Iranian-US relations can improve, and maybe US can have some influence on what Iran does in the region. So these views of what the JCPOA success would mean go in opposite directions. I don't see anything good coming out of this in terms of US-GCC relations, unless the US is once again called upon to intervene, and called upon by itself in a situation in which the country's sovereignty is put at risk, and the US proves itself again to be the indispensable power. Otherwise, I think the appeal of going elsewhere and, in a sense, thumbing your nose at the United States of America will still exist.
Well, thank you all. That I found it was a lot of fun. It was a really good discussion. Like everything else in this part of the world, it ended inconclusively. And it was a great segue into our next Gulf International Forum program next week, same time, same station, in which we discuss the signing of a new JCPOA, or maybe the failure of the signing of a next JCPOA. So thank you all very much, and look forward to future programs, and to all my friends. Bob, boss, see you.
Just waving goodbye.